Our play is called Old Ymir's Clay Pot, and it is based on what you heard from Isaiah chapter 29, and it deals with the whole idea of being God's creature. You might remember that in the Garden of Eden, when Satan wanted to tempt Adam and Eve, the thing that he tempted them with was the fruit of the tree. But the thing they would gain by disobeying God, the promise, the empty promise that Satan gave them was, you shall be like God. Ooh, sounds like a promotion, doesn't it? And so they ate, and you know the rest of the story. But you know, ever since then, all people, including you and me, have this struggle of wanting to put ourselves on a pedestal, to not let God be God, but instead to try to be the managers of our own lives. There's a commandment that talks about this. In fact, it's the first one. You shall have no other gods before you. Our play talks about this issue in terms of the potter and the clay. And as I said, it is called Old Ymir's Clay Pot.
This is the ancient story of what happened when old Ymir the potter came into town and created a masterpiece.
Once upon a quiet winter morning,
A very, very long time ago indeed,
when the sky over the still sleeping town hung heavy with snow,
and the thick, drawn clouds of dawn seemed to roll in great swells down from the mountains and out over the sea.
on a morning just like that,
Still and silent,
old Ymir the potter came to town.
old Ymir, with skin like wrinkled leather and a thick gray beard as tough as wire. Old Ymir, a head taller than any man alive and older and wiser than God himself.
He was going to open a pottery shop.
He twisted a huge iron key in a lock choked with rust,
Pushed open a battered wooden door,
and stepped inside a gray, stone-walled hut full of shadows and corners and years at the end of a street just 381 snow-hidden paving blocks from the sea.
The cold wind pushed in behind him, and old Ymir quickly slammed the door, rattling the shelves of the small, unwarmed room.
Then he opened his shop.
Pushing aside with his hand the stiff leather drapery that hung in the doorway, he squeaked into the workshop.
It was sullen, ill-lit little room in the rear, full of creaking, complaining old floorboards, and scarcely quite large enough to contain the vast amount of dust and moldy smell that filled it, much less the assorted odds and ends of the potter's trade that held it besides.
A rickety wheel, caked hard with old bits of clay, a large tan brick kiln cold as death, a table, a chair, and a bed,
all very thoroughly webbed and entangled by time and the spiders and the dust.
Old Ymir put down his pack in the center of the room and got to work. He scraped clean the potter's wheel, lighted the kiln, and cleared all the shelves and the tables and the chairs of their cobwebs and dust. He swept up the floor, went off after fuel, gathered the clay, and chased all the mice from the bed. Then he hung out a sign,
Ymir, master maker of pots.
Rubbed his hands and began. Day after day, his wheels spun madly. Day after day, old Ymir molded the soft, fine clay, fashioning it as it spun, and soon the kiln, warming and cheering the hard-working potter from morning till evening, was brimful of all sorts of glowing big bowls and deep crocks and small pots, all baking inside its red belly to a fine, hard, glazed surface as smooth to the touch as the wax of a newly dipped taper.
And old Ymir was smiling because he enjoyed his work so.
One evening, there were finished pots everywhere. And in the yellow light of a taper, the shelves were full of a most wonderful variety of shapes and shadows and lines and circles of pots and pots and pots.
From the very lowest shelves near the floor to the topmost shelves near the ceiling, they stood row on long row.
Some out on the counter and some under it.
Some on the floor near the back of the room.
And the workshop in the rear was chock full from front to back, so that old Ymir scarcely had a place to sleep.
Enough cups and bowls and plates to feed the whole world, it seemed.
There were slender vases, beautiful to behold for flowers.
There were bowls for mixing bread dough.
Huge pots for ashes from the fires.
Rows of dishes and cups and saucers and plates.
Square ones and round ones.
Tall ones and tiny ones.
Big pots.
And short pots.
And fat pots.
And squat pots. The most wonderful pots in the whole wicked world. And as old Ymir stood back wiping his hands and resting against the counter in front of the shop, he looked at his handiwork and smiled again, because the pots were good and he liked them.
You are very pretty pots,
he said, complimenting them.
And they all thanked him and said,
We are glad you have made us so fine.
Then he patted a fat, cheerful bowl on the belly, cheered a tall, lonely vase with a long, sober face, put out the taper and walked to the front of the shop. He looked out through the window into the snowy street beyond it. He stood there a long time, and his smile dissolved in thought.
There was a broad, smooth patch of ice before the shop.
On the topmost shelf, a plate rolled over carelessly in its sleep and almost fell off.
Next morning, old Ymir put up a sign.
A giant red sign with white letters over the door
that read,
Open today.
And he stood behind the counter, smiling and waiting for customers. Impatiently, he tapped his fingers on the top of the counter. But he stood there all morning and no one came. No one even tried the door. And his smile soon went away.
About noon, 3 or 4 women with frost-pink noses and cheeks, their breath hanging in small clouds before them, did peer in at the front window, looking at the shelves full of pots and the potter, who smiled at them, but they only shrugged their shoulders and went on.
Later in the afternoon, when a small humpbacked man, hidden to his nose in a mountain of red wool, hobbled in, he closed the door behind him, stood suddenly rigid in his peculiar bent-over position, and looked slowly around the room, much disturbed and amazed. After a blank moment or two, he grabbed awkwardly at the door, saying,
Pardon, sir, I thought this was the meat sellers. I must have made a mistake.
And went out, shaking his head and glancing at the sign as he went.
Potter,
he said.
What next?
And he closed the door.
But that was all. No one else came. Nobody bought because nobody knew just how fine a potter old Ymir really was.
When he closed up for the night and walked slowly toward the workshop where his bed was, old Ymir saw that all the pots on the shelves were sad, and some of them were crying, and he thought perhaps he might forget the whole idea.
What good are pots,
he said,
when no one buys?
Yes,
said a crotchety brown crock in a corner.
What good is all your work when no one knows?
And they all tried to sleep. But later that night, as he lay on his bed, the warm redness of the open kiln lit up the room, and on the wall above old Ymir there grew as big as a tree the black shadow of the potter's wheel standing idle on the other side of the room in front of the kiln.
It grew and grew before his eyes until it seemed that it engulfed the whole room. And he pounded his fist on the mattress and cried aloud,
"I'll do it!"
And he sat bolt upright in his bed.
"I'll do it!"
And getting out of bed, he lit a taper and went into the shop.
"It will require all my strength, all my strength."
He walked across the room and stood in the posture of a public speaker before the crowded gallery of shelves.
"It will be my finest work, my very finest work, a showpiece of so rare a beauty and so fine a form that in its greatness and simplicity it will reach out and touch the hearts of busy, barren men occupied with worry and with work and with children at their play, of old men stroking beards and women baking bread and proud kings rich with scents of wine and war, of all men everywhere, this clay, this bit of crockery, for this small fleck of earth, this dub of dust, shall be."
And he paused, looking from bowl to bowl and pot to pot.
"My masterpiece."
Then he nodded slightly to the cheers of all the pots and bowls and dishes, and the applause still ringing in his ears. Abed again, he slept well.
But all night long, the shelves in the little shop vibrated with the chatter of the cups and crocks and plates as they argued and speculated about just what the little masterpiece would be.
Next morning, old Ymir was up before dawn.
He walked to the fields and dug from the cold, hard ground the finest clay he could find.
Then returning, he placed it on the wheel and began to shape a bowl.
He worked long and hard.
No one in town saw him all that day, for he never went out,
He did not eat.
making his new creation
Beautiful,
useful
dainty,
and strong,
shaping and molding it, standing back and inspecting it,
despairing
and destroying,
and discarding.
and beginning again,
All day long and far into the night he labored,
and then until dawn,
and then through the next day,
until finally
about sundown,
it was finished. And old Ymir sighed and smiled and went to bed. He slept fitfully that night, tossing and turning in the darkness, and awoke next morning without rest to fret and pace in large impatient circles through the days that followed while the new clay cured and dried. And then, when the intolerable wait was over, with the first faint light of morning on that day of days, he hurried over to the kiln and took out the bowl. Proudly he placed it on the counter, and all over the shop, all the other pots and bowls and plates and crocks and cups said,
"Ooh,
and,
my, how beautiful."
for it was a masterpiece. Then no one said anything, but old Ymir was smiling.
"Hello,"
said the little pot finally.
for in those days pots could talk like people.
"Hello,
Smiled old Ymir.
do you know what you are?"
The pot thought it over.
That is never an easy question.
"Well, I am a pot, that I know,"
Yes,
said old Ymir.
and much more. You are a masterpiece of such unique creation and preeminent design that but allow one bit of breath with eyes and ears, however crude and vulgar, merely to glimpse you from afar upon my counter, and all life with sense of sight and sound will rush from all the earth to see you, and they will trust my skill because of you, because I have made you, and they will buy from the excellent stock of my shelves.
"Oh, I am glad to be so wonderfully made. I shall be very happy to help you and to think all the people will admire me.
You can do everything. You are all things for every man.
All things?
All things, I say, for in one glance all men will see in you all my best qualities and craftsmanship, my artistry and ability. Men will fall in love with all I stand for when they look at you.
Oh, I'm a beautiful and wonderful pot, and you are a great potter.
Thank you.
But what now? Tell me distinctly, what shall I have to do?
Many things. A few people will come in looking for a vase, delicate and fine, for flowers. And then you will have to hold flowers for them.
I shall like that very much.
Good. There will also be ladies who are looking for a bowl in which to mix the dough for their loaves and cakes, big, round, and smooth.
That shall be all right, if it is nice, moist, sweet-smelling dough that's put in me.
And some will want a strong, sturdy pot to hold the refuse from the kitchen and the hearth.
I shall not like that very much. I do not think I want to do that.
It will be your work.
Still, I will not like it. I am far too fine a masterpiece to be used for such smelly work, don't you think?
It is part of your fineness to do it.
I like flower holding better.
I have made you to do both. Each is a noble service.
Nevertheless, I shall balk at garbage.
No, you shall not. I have made you, and I tell you, men shall use you for their pipe ashes and old tobacco and the ashes from the hearth and garbage, and you shall not balk.
I am no crock for refuse.
You are all things for all men.
All things indeed.
Yes. And men will sometimes even clear their throats and spit in you.
And spit?
They will.
I will not stand for that.
You shall. Flowers and spittle both are alike. They are fashioned for a purpose, just like you, and you must hold them both. It is your work.
I will not do such filth.
You shall, for I know what is right.
But you do not know what is right for me. Flowers are right for me, not spittle.
I promise you flowers, but there must be spittle too. I serve all needs. You show men how. And finally, when your work is finished, I will put you high on the topmost shelf out of reach of all the common people of the town, only to hold the most perfect of roses and lilacs and lilies all the year long.
The price is too high. No flowers if there must be spittle. And if you insist on threatening me with spittle, I will not even hold flowers for you when you let me. I shall refuse to do anything.
Have you no respect for your maker?
No, I am a beautiful vase, and I am beginning to think that it may even be that I have made myself.
You are a misbehaving child.
I don't care.
You are rebellious.
I have feelings.
And by heaven, you shall feel them too. I promise you, if you're not careful. I tolerate no pride and no rebellion. If you do not carry out my will, I will punish you.
I don't believe you try.
I shall. I'll smash you into bits with this hammer and strew you on the very icy walks before my shop, and people will tread on you and trample you into the hard, cold ground, and the carts on the street and the animals will grind you slowly into dust. You shall be punished.
If you threaten me, I shall never do anything for you. I shall jump right off the counter and break myself when the first customer walks in and asks to see your wares. And I will hurt you that way because you will not sell any pots or bowls, because the people will not see me and no one will ever know.
Well, old Ymir would have slapped the little pot then and there, but at that moment the door opened, and the little humpbacked man from some days back came in again and wondered, did old Ymir know just where was the meat sellers? Because he'd been, and then he saw it. he saw the masterpiece sitting on the counter where old Ymir had put it. Awed and overwhelmed by the simple beauty of the little pot, he came closer to get a better look.
Old Ymir smiled good morning.
The little pot tried to jump as it had warned the potter it would.
It wanted to break itself into a million bits just to see the look on old Ymir's face.
But then it remembered that if it broke itself into a million bits, it wouldn't be able to see the look on old Ymir's face. And though it looked at the floor and closed its eyes, it couldn't bring itself to do it. It no longer had the courage, and angered with its own weakness,
Bursting with shame and frustration,
it could do nothing but close tightly its eyes and ears and sit.
and it did.
It couldn't hear and it couldn't see, but before long it felt flowers being placed into it and sensed the slow vibrations of the humpback's approving voice.
But even the flowers had become distasteful to it.
And it swore it heard the little customer clearing his throat and preparing to spit.
Confused,
Afraid,
angry,
afraid to jump,
afraid to sit,
afraid to hold the flowers.
and
Oh, horror!
afraid not to.
In the jumble of its swirling emotions, it shook so that it faltered clumsily and dropped the flowers.
And they spilled all over the counter.
The little man was laughing with glee when the little pot opened its ears at last, and it could hear him hobble out of the shop and slam the door,
Still coughing
and choking,
and spitting.
and laughing.
And he walked down the cold street.
When the pot opened its eyes, it saw only the hot, angry stare of old Ymir's huge eyes.
Oh well,
The pot said, shrugging and feigning nonchalance.
how can you expect me to hold flowers for you when I must always be afraid someone will spit in me?
You are a wicked pot!
Shouted old Ymir, and it seemed to the other pots that there were flames in old Ymir's mouth and eyes.
You are a wicked pot. I will destroy your wickedness with the morning.
And old Ymir went to bed. The shelves and shelves of pots and bowls all cried themselves to sleep. Then the night watchman walked by once on the street.
The little pot stood alone in the night, shivering, afraid of the morning, afraid of the punishment, afraid of the hammer and the feet and the cold and the carts in the street. The pot stared longingly down at the flowers strewn about it on the counter and wished to hold them high so that old Ymir might have mercy. But all the pot could do was sob big wet sobs full of big wet tears that rolled down its side and fell like dew on the colored petals. For old Ymir hadn't made the pot with any arms, so there wasn't any way for it to pick up the flowers.
And then it happened. During the night somehow,
Suddenly, perhaps,
with the speed of starlight's day,
or love,
it happened.
new clay began in some mysterious way to leap up onto the wheel,
The wheel to spin,
slowly at first and then quite dizzily,
and unseen hands to work
shaping and molding
to its perfect form.
a deed of altogether unforeseen magnificence,
A work of unutterable love,
a wonder in the night,
to be remembered ever afterward as
the miracle of the clay.
a simple pot,
One more,
a bowl,
a dab of dust,
a bit of earthenware,
yet much, much more.
one last great triumph from the master potter's wheel,
One final favored showpiece for the timid trade,
one final sample,
one preeminent example more
useful and fine,
of wizardry and skill and master craftsmanship.
exactly like the first in every way,
A perfect double for the little pot that talked back,
all moist and new now on the spinning potter's wheel.
a masterpiece, a work of wonder and of genius, newborn in the night.
And when the coals deep in the kiln began to glow, as though it were the breath of old Ymir himself that breathed on them, and not that merely of some old and tattered bellows puffing, suddenly again, in some unnatural way, in one split second, or quite likely even less, the new pot seemed both in and out of its hot belly, and already cooled, baked hard, and beautiful and smooth there in the cold, dark night. And as it stood atop the bench, it seemed to the staring dark to be
like him,
the master potter,
old Ymir himself,
his work,
his soul,
his being,
yet
a pot.
quickly the new little pot rolled to the front of the shop and climbed up onto the counter, where the little pot that talked back still stood, frightened and shivering among the flowers it had refused to hold and could not pick up. The other pot nudged the little pot out of the way, somehow managed it down beneath the counter and hid it away in the dust of a cobwebby corner on some dark shelf far away to the rear from old Ymir's searching eyes.
A few moments later, in a quiet pool of moonlight, in the midst of the fallen flowers where the little pot had been, stood the miraculous new creation, waiting for old Ymir and the morning.
In another patch of light near a window lay the hammer.
Before long, the first cold streaks of dawn appeared, and with them,
the potter, anxious to have done with his sorrowing business as quick as possible, his wrath at the wickedness of the clay welling up inside him and spreading like a poison through his arms and fingers,
he seized his hammer with the fury of fire.
And seeing the pot in the midst of the withered dead flowers still strewn about,
brought it down like a thunderclap upon the newborn masterpiece,
and shattered it into 1,000,000 tiny bits of colored pot that flew about through the air with a cry of pain and landed in a shower of clay on the floor at his feet.
The other bowls and dishes on the shelves could only stare and shiver, and cowered in the corners where they could, and an oppressive silence settled upon the room. There was no noise but the heavy breathing of old Ymir and the clanging of the broken pieces as he swept them out onto the icy sidewalk in the street.
A heavy cart soon rumbled by, its wheels humping and bumping over the snow-clad cobblestones with a crunching, grinding noise.
It wasn't until later in the day, when the potter was cleaning out the dark shelves under his counter and whisking away the cobwebs crisscrossing them, that he discovered, hidden away among the dust and crying quietly to itself, the little pot that had talked back, cowering and afraid, washing the shelf with its tears.
In its mouth, it was holding tightly a single flower that had somehow got there since the morning, a beautiful, pure white rose.
Will you punish me now, too?
Asked the pot of old Ymir.
I've been very horrible to you,
No,
said old Ymir.
I have already punished your wickedness.
And the little pot just stared. It didn't quite know what to make of it all.
Don't be afraid.
Said old Ymir.
My anger is gone.
And he smiled.
Then the little pot smiled too. It seemed as if the potter might have known all along that all this might have been in his plan right from the beginning.
All right,
it said. And that night, the people that walked past old Ymir's shop and into it, for business was heavy, noticed that an unusual thing had happened. The ground before the shop was glowing with a strange and marvelous light right where old Ymir had thrown down the broken pieces of pot. In fact, upon closer inspection, they discovered that the light was coming from all the little bits of clay themselves that lay upon it.
Day and night, the strange light continued.
Day after day, night after night, all was the same, and then suddenly,
one night,
in a twinkling,
it was gone.
and no one ever saw anything exactly like it again.
But people couldn't help wondering what had happened. They're wondering to this very day.
Thank you.